No one wanted to mate with the disgusting furry alien until the human came along. He stood at the threshold of the wrecked alien stronghold, boots grinding against shattered metal and broken glass, his breath low and steady as he surveyed the aftermath of battle. The lights flickered overhead in intermittent bursts, and each sudden flash caught the reflective gleam of blood. Some human, some alien, streaked across the walls. Debris tumbled in sporadic cascades, echoing through the corridor. Kane scanned the dim passage with that signature wolfish smirk ghosting across his lips, as if anticipating another threat, and then he saw her, crouched in a locked cell, her eyes glinting in the half-light, feline ears perked upright in silent challenge. He paused, mind instantly assessing her posture. Her tail flicked once against the floor, betraying a combination of alertness and amusement. The swirling tattoos, wrapping her arms and torso, glowed faintly, pulsing with each measured breath. Kane blinked, muscles tightening for a beat as he noted the subtle shift in temperature around her, an aura of warmth and life that felt more menacing than comforting. 2 heartbeats passed in silent tension, neither of them moving, both sizing up the other. A slow wave of adrenaline spiked through him at the curiosity in her eyes. She tilted her head, curls framing the pointed curve of her ears, and let a small predatory smile curl her lips. Did they send a human to gawk at the untouchable? Her voice cut the silence like a blade. Careful, soldier, I bite. Kane's smirk deepened, though his gaze remained ice-cold. Good, he answered quietly. I like my prisoners with some fight. A faint hum of power coursed through the damaged corridor as the cell's locks malfunctioned, flickering. In and out of containment mode, Sharen rose slowly, fluidly, as though the force of gravity held less sway over her. Her wrists were bound by a crackling energy cuff, but the controlled tension in her posture suggested she was already testing the restraints. Kane took a single step forward, bringing him just beyond the barrier that separated them. A hiss of static filled the air, and Sharen's glowing tattoos pulsed brighter along her bare shoulders and arms. Her eyes narrowed. Come closer if you dare, she murmured, flicking her gaze at the sputtering lock. I've never minded having to spill blood to earn my freedom. He answered by lifting his pulse rifle in a deliberate, unhurried motion. Its muzzle trained on her. The corridor smelled of scorched metal, ozone from discharged blaster rounds, and the bitter tang of fear that seemed to linger from the battles that took place minutes earlier. But neither Sharen nor Kane smelled of fear. They both smelled of confrontation, of victory stolen from the jaws of chaos. You'll step out of that cell, Kane said, voice a calm command, and you'll come quietly, or I'll drag you out, and we'll see how tough you really are. Sharen laughed, a low, throaty sound. She tested the cuff around her wrists. Tiny arcs of electricity snapped at her furred ears, and she winced just enough for Kane to notice. I've known men stronger than you who've failed to break me, she said, voice laced with contempt. Don't flatter yourself. Yet, she took one cautious step closer, the barrier between them flickering once again. Kane glanced back to make sure the corridor was still clear, then reached out to manipulate the external console. Red sparks and half-melted circuitry gave him trouble, but eventually he managed to override the lockdown. The barrier vanished, leaving nothing between them except the stale air and rising tension. Sharen locked gazes with Kane as she crossed the threshold. Her sleek furred ears twitched, and the swirling patterns on her skin glowed in time with her heartbeat. He didn't step back. Their proximity made every sense in Kane's body hum with awareness, and he saw that dangerous curiosity in her eyes grow sharper. She towered a little less than him, but the presence she commanded made him feel as though she loomed like a predator. The flick of her tail against the floor sent a near-electric jolt through his legs, an inexplicable primal reaction he refused to outwardly acknowledge. He forced his focus onto the mission, onto the reason his team had scoured this stronghold in the first place. He angled his rifle slightly. Move, he ordered. We have no time to linger. Sharen's lip curled into an almost insolent smile, even as she complied, stepping past him into the corridor. The overhead lights fizzled, plunging the hall into near darkness before flickering again. The tension in her shoulders suggested she was poised to strike the moment his guard dropped. Kane liked that. Too many of his prisoners cowered. She was different, fearless in a way that intrigued him, though he kept that curiosity buried. They moved through the ruined corridors, stepping over scorched alien bodies and shattered mechanical drones. Every so often, Sharen tested Kane's control, pausing slightly, glancing over her shoulder to see if he'd make a move. His unwavering, rifle muzzle and the cold set of his jaw answered her challenge. Their steps echoed, accompanied by the distant whine of failing ventilation systems. Kane knew their time in this stronghold was short. Reinforcements from both sides might arrive, at any moment. At a fork in the corridor, the flickering lights illuminated 3 more halls. One collapsed entirely, blocked by twisted beams. The second hallway led back to the outer structure. The third extended into the base's command center. Kane's mission was to retrieve intelligence from the command center, but he suspected enemy forces might still be stationed there. He pressed a hand against Sharen's back, guiding her forward. She tensed at his touch, tail snapping to one side. "Hands off," she hissed. Kane didn't remove his hand. "You want to—" "Get out of here in one piece," he said, voice low. "Then do as I say." He felt a surge of satisfaction at her quiet snarl. With the intelligence drive still unaccounted for, he needed her cooperation, or at least her grudging compliance. She might be exiled from her own kind, but she likely knew more about the base's layout than he did. She bared her teeth. But her eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. "I might know a safer path," she said. "Not because I'm helping you, but because I don't like the smell of your spilled blood any more than I like the chains around my wrists." Kane gave her a nod to proceed. With slow, fluid movements, she took the lead. A shimmering glow pulsated down her arms, tracing those swirling tattoos, and he realized it might be an involuntary response, her body's temperature-sensing adaptability reacting to the environment. She stopped suddenly, putting a hand to the wall, ears swiveling as if she could hear something beyond Kane's perception. Her tail flicked again and she crouched, beckoning him closer with a curl of her fingers. "There are at least 2 of your men ahead," she whispered. "But they're not alone." Kane strained to hear the commotion. Faint voices, an alien growl, the mechanical hum of an assault drone. "Are you sure they're my men?" he asked quietly. She shot him a scornful glance, ear twitching. "They're speaking your language. They sound desperate. Something else is with them." Kane's grip on his rifle tightened. If his squadmates had run into enemy survivors, the firefight must still be ongoing. He motioned for Sharen to stay close, and they advanced in tense silence. The corridor widened into a massive loading area. Glancing past crates and half-burned vehicles, Kane saw 2 of his fellow soldiers, Torres and Lien, huddled behind a collapsed hover platform, exchanging frantic blaster fire with a monstrous alien war machine. The war machine, one of the warlord's personal guard drones, stood on 4 piston-like legs, with rotating cannons for arms. The flickering overhead lights caught the glint of its metal carapace, and the shriek of its targeting sensors made Kane's teeth clench. Another volley of blazing plasma bolts strafed the hover platform, sending showers of sparks flying. Kane heard Torres cry out, pinned. Without waiting for a plan, Kane stepped into the open, rifle snapping up. He fired a stream of shots at the drone's hind joints, aiming to cripple its mobility. Sharen, caught in the adrenaline of the moment, sprang into action beside him. Despite the energy cuffs restraining her wrists, she lunged forward and raked her claws across an exposed wire on the machine's flank. A small arc of electricity erupted, but it wasn't enough to destroy it. The drone swiveled an arm cannon her way. Kane snarled, racing forward to intercept. He bashed the drone's cannon with the butt of his rifle, forcing its aim off target. Plasma bolts tore chunks out of the ground. Sharen hissed in pain as a stray piece of shrapnel cut across her shoulder, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she latched onto the drone's hind leg, her body glowing with an unearthly luminescence as she fought to tear open a panel. Kane fired again at the drone's cockpit, each shot finding its mark. Metal screeched, and the drone toppled, sparks dancing across its hull. Torres let out a cheer. Lien, panting, waved them closer. Kane rushed to their side, helping them up from behind the ruined hover platform. Both soldiers looked battered, their armor scorched, but they still clutched their rifles with a determined grip. They stared at Sharen warily. She glared back, tail swishing. "Who the hell is that?" Torres demanded between ragged breaths. Kane didn't break his gaze from Sharen as he replied, "She's our prisoner, Exiled royalty from the looks of it, and dangerous as they come. He jerked his head toward the looming corridor that likely led to the command center. We're extracting the intel, then getting out. Lien looked Sharen up and down, noticing the furred ears, the glow of her tattoos, the unmistakable aura that set her apart from other aliens they'd encountered. She'll slow us down. Sharen raised an eyebrow. I don't take kindly to insults from corpses in waiting, she sneered, voice dripping with contempt. Keep out of my way. Torres was about to retort when another explosion rocked the base. The floor quaked beneath them, and an ominous rumble sounded somewhere deeper in the structure. Sharen closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling. Those blasts are getting closer, she said, flicking an ear. Either the base is collapsing, or more of your enemies are trying to smoke you out. Kane's instinct screamed at him to move fast. No time to debate. Torres, Lien, fall in. He turned to Sharen. You know where the command room is, lead. She bared her teeth in a mocking semblance of a smile. Since you asked so nicely, she said, stepping forward. She started at a brisk pace, unafraid of forging ahead, her ears and tail indicating high alert. The humans followed, forming a wary triangle behind her. Together they navigated broken corridors and narrow walkways, passing evidence of a brutal conflict. Alien bodies, shattered machinery, the stench of burning metal thick in the stale air. Every few paces, Kane caught himself watching her. The shape of her exposed midriff, the swirl of shimmering black tattoos along her shoulders, the tension in her back that spoke of lethal grace. He refused to dwell on it. This was a mission and she was a hostile captive, albeit an intriguing one, but he couldn't deny that something about her drew his gaze. He silently cursed himself for even acknowledging it. The next corridor opened, into a wide antechamber. Rusted consoles lined one wall, flickering holographic readouts half-burned and unreadable. In the center, a circular blast door that likely led to the command center. Sharen surveyed it with narrowed eyes, pressing a hand to the door's sensor. It gave an angry beep and refused to move. She scoffed. Sealed from the inside. Either your intel is destroyed or someone in there doesn't want visitors. Lien stepped forward, tapping on a portable hacking device. Torres watched Sharen like a hawk, finger on the trigger. Kane moved to stand beside her, ignoring the suspicious glance from Torres. You told me you had a safer path, he said quietly. What's on the other side? Sharen lifted a shoulder in a half-shrug. Storage bay. Possibly an escape corridor to the surface, or maybe a dead end. My memory of this place isn't perfect. She paused, eyes drifting to his face. You're eager for that data. Whatever it is, it means enough to risk all our lives. Kane's jaw tightened. He could see the question in her gaze. What personal stake did he have? Why was he pushing so hard? Instead of explaining, he stepped back. Because I don't leave a mission half-finished. As Lien worked on bypassing the door's lock, Sharen stood close, her voice dropping to a near purr. A soldier's pride, she teased. Humans cling to that until it kills them, or until something else kills them first. He turned to meet her eyes. You seem determined to provoke me. She smiled wickedly, her ears twitching. I want to see how far you'll go before you break. Before Kane could reply, the blast door rumbled. Lien had managed to override the locking mechanism, and with a screech of metal it slid open. The musty air rushing out carried the scent of ozone and stale electronics. Kane slipped ahead, rifle raised, scanning for threats. The command center was dim, emergency lights casting a red glow across walls plastered with alien script. A single figure slumped over the main console, unmoving, while overhead displays flickered with urgent warnings in a language half recognized by the human team. Torres hurried over to the console, nudging the alien corpse aside. Kane joined him, flipping a switch to try to bring the console to life. Sharen circled around, tail swishing warily, eyes scanning the overhead pipes and vents, ears perked for any sign of hidden threats. Lien guarded the doorway, weapon at the ready. Find the data drive, Kane said. Torres nodded, rummaging through the compartments beneath the console. The entire structure rumbled again, dust sifting from the ceiling. Kine felt the slow unraveling of stability. The base was not going to stand for much longer. Sharen stepped closer, peering at the alien text on one of the screens. "This station is beyond salvage," she said, tapping a glowing panel. "The meltdown process has started. You probably have 10 minutes before the energy reactor goes critical." Kane's jaw clenched. "Torres, hurry!" Torres pried open a small compartment near the console's base. "Got it," he announced, holding up a cylindrical drive. "We can pull out now." An explosion rattled the corridor behind them. Kane's heart pounded, and he spun to see a fireball surging through the open doorway. Leon dove aside, narrowly, avoiding the flames. The overhead lights blew out, plunging the room into red emergency glow. A half-dozen heavily armed alien soldiers charged in amidst the smoke, weapons raised. A deafening volley of energy bolts tore through the command center. Kine shouted for cover, returning fire. Torres ducked behind a console, clutching the data drive. Lean fired from the opposite side, while Sharen leaped across the narrow gap, her bound hands coming up to strike an alien soldier's weapon. She twisted in midair, her body an agile blur, tail snapping. Her bioluminescent tattoos flared bright, illuminating the chaos as she wrested the weapon free and used it to blast another alien in the chest. Kane admired her fluid movements for a fraction of a heartbeat. Though her wrists were still cuffed, she moved with lethal grace, an unstoppable momentum behind each blow. He tore his gaze away to unload his rifle into an alien who raised a blade to strike Leon from behind. Smoke and the acrid smell of burning flesh choked the air. The frenzied exchange ended with alien bodies strewn across the floor, and the command center's control panels sparking dangerously. Sharen stood amid the carnage, chest heaving. She tossed away the confiscated weapon, ears flattening as a series of warning klaxons blared throughout the base. Then the console behind her crackled with electricity, sending arcs across the room. The meltdown was imminent. "We have to leave," she snapped, glaring at Kane, "unless you'd prefer to be turned into molten scraps." "Torres, Lien, move!" Kane barked. They sprinted for the exit. Sharen broke into a run beside him. They dashed back the way they'd come, but fallen debris and structural collapse forced them into unfamiliar corridors. Fires raged in the distance, and pipes burst, spraying scalding steam that hissed against the exposed metal. Kine had to duck more than once to avoid overhead beams that fell as the base gave its final death throes. At a flickering intersection, Sharen darted left without warning, ignoring Kane's hiss to stay in sight. He and the others followed, trusting her knowledge, or at least her instincts. The corridor opened into a wide hangar, half caved in from an earlier blast, yet they spotted an abandoned troop transport craft in the corner. Smoke billowed around it, but it appeared operational. Sharen rushed forward, slipping inside. With practiced ease, Kane was right behind, pulling Torres and Leon in. They scrambled over the controls, flipping switches in a frantic attempt to power up the engines. With a painful whir and a cloud of thick smoke, the craft systems came online. Through the viewport, they could see the hangar's overhead doors jammed shut by twisted metal. "Stand aside," Sharen growled, shoving aside some of the console wreckage. She pressed a palm against the local interface, and her tattoos glowed brighter, as if responding to some internal surge of energy. The hangar doors trembled, then ground open just enough for them to slip through. The meltdown alarms blared louder, a crescendo of doom. The transport lurched out of the hangar on failing thrusters. Kine wrestled with the controls, trying to steady their ascent, while Sharen sat co-pilot, rapidly bypassing security protocols. Fire and smoke belched from the base below, and the hull of the transport shuddered violently. Torres and Lien clung to whatever handholds they could find, eyes wide as the craft cleared the ground. Moments later, the base erupted behind them, in a pillar of flame. The shockwave nearly knocked them out of the sky. Kane fought the controls, gritting his teeth, until they leveled out above the scorched landscape. The clouds overhead shimmered with atmospheric disturbance. Heart-pounding, Kane turned to Sharen, who gave him a triumphant, if slightly savage, grin. "You're lucky I value my own life enough to save yours," she said. He flicked a quick glance at her glowing tattoos. "Don't be so sure," he said, voice rough, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. We're not out of this yet. Torres clutched the data drive, panting. We got what we came for. Command will be waiting. Sharen leaned back, tail curling around her. Command might be waiting, but not for me, she said softly. I assume your human leaders will want to drag me to some laboratory for analysis, or maybe they'll just kill me when you hand me over. Kane didn't answer immediately. His stare bored into her, and for a moment no one spoke. The hum of the transport's engines rose and fell in battered cycles. Finally, he shook his head. I'm under orders to bring you in, he said simply, flicking a switch to stabilize the craft's flight path. But we'll see. Sharen's ears lowered as if in annoyance or challenge, but she offered no further argument. The tension between them, already electric, seemed to coil tighter, like a steel cable near the breaking point. Above the battered landscape, the transport soared on battered thrusters, carrying them all toward an uncertain horizon. They never made it to command. Just as the transport cleared the thick storm clouds over the alien planet, a final quake shook the craft, and the instruments went haywire. Kane cursed, wrestling the controls as the thrusters coughed and died. They spiraled downward. Sharen scrambled to keep the craft stable, but with every second they lost altitude. Torres and Lien braced themselves, shouting in alarm. Kane's smirk vanished, replaced by a hard line of focus. A green vista opened below them, endless jungle dotted with jagged cliffs and towering trees. The transport lurched side to side in a violent descent. Sharen managed to power the auxiliary thrusters just long enough to reduce the impact as they crashed through the canopy. Branches snapped, metal groaned, and the world spun in a cacophony of ripping, rending sounds, until finally, with a jarring thud, the transport came to rest in a clearing. Smoke billowed from the ruined engines. Kane's vision swam as he unbuckled himself, adrenaline still pumping. Sharen was already upright, pulling at the cracked cockpit door. Torres and Lien groaned from the back, but they were alive. The craft's hull threatened to buckle under the stress, so there was no time to waste. Kane forced the door open, stepping onto the spongy jungle floor. Towering trees soared overhead, thick vines crossing in a dense canopy that blocked much of the daylight. The air felt wet and heavy, buzzing with the sound of alien insects. Sharen was beside him, scanning the environment. Her nose wrinkled. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere," she said, voice edged with a sardonic bite. "If the crash didn't kill us, this jungle might." Torres emerged, limping slightly. Lien supported him. Both looked to Kane. "What now, Sergeant?" Lien asked, glancing anxiously at the transport. Thick black smoke coiled into the sky, marking their position like a beacon. Kane's mind was already turning over possible solutions. "We can't stay here. If there are hostile forces anywhere on this planet, they'll see that smoke and come, we move." Sharen eyed the direction of the setting sun, or what little she could discern through the canopy. "I've heard about these jungles," she murmured, half to herself. "They're teeming with predators, some large enough to crush that transport with a single blow, and the plant life might be as dangerous as the beasts." Lien frowned. "You sound almost happy about that." Sharshan cast him a sidelong look, the corner of her mouth curving. "I enjoy a challenge." Her gaze flicked back to Kane. "And I'm no prisoner of yours anymore, soldier. Not out here." Kane took a slow step forward, letting the muzzle of his rifle rest low but still pointed near her. "You want to try running?" he said, voice dangerously quiet. "Go ahead. My bet is you won't last long alone, and in case you forgot, those cuffs are still on you." His eyes dropped to the energy shackles around her wrists. They had to be interfering with her more advanced abilities, or at least limiting her. Her ears flattened slightly, but not in fear. She squared her shoulders, tail curling behind her. "Don't mistake me for helpless, but I see you have injuries among your men." She nodded toward Torres's battered leg. "He'll slow you down and you'll need me if you want to survive. That's the only reason I haven't left yet." Kane almost smirked, but the tension in his jaw wouldn't allow it. He glanced, at Lien, then at Torres, who leaned heavily on his comrade, blood trickling down his temple. "Then let's find a defensible spot. We'll treat Torres's wounds, figure out our next move." No one argued. The oppressive heat and humidity enveloped them as they moved deeper into the dense foliage. Vines dangled overhead, and the ground was thick with tangled roots and slick mud. Massive flowers glowed luminescent in the dim light, occasionally, pulsing with a faint bioluminescence that reminded Kane of Sharen's tattoos. The air carried a ripe, earthy scent mixed with something vaguely sulfuric. Sharen walked several paces ahead, her bound hands still capable of pushing aside broad leaves. She moved like she belonged in this environment, ears twitching at every rustle. Kane noticed her tail stiffen, and she suddenly held up a hand. Leon gripped his weapon while Torres gritted his teeth, slumping against a tree trunk for support. A low snarl echoed through the jungle. Something rustled in the underbrush. Sharen crouched, peering into the darkness. Kane's rifle followed her line of sight. A pair of glowing yellow eyes glared back. Then, with a bone-chilling growl, a feline-like predator emerged, a hulking creature with 6 legs and spines down its back. It hissed, displaying rows of sharp teeth, each glistening with drool. "Stay behind me," Kane said quietly to Leon, and Torres stepping forward. Sharen shot him a dismissive glance, as though she had no intention of letting him handle this alone. The beast crept closer, muscles rippling beneath coarse fur. Each step it took crushed the vegetation, its nostrils flaring. Kane could almost feel its hunger radiating in waves. He slid his finger over the rifle's trigger. Sharen moved, a lightning-quick blur. Despite her cuffs, she grabbed a sturdy, fallen branch from the ground and brandished it like a staff, her tattoos casting a subtle glow in the dim light. The predator snarled, torn between attacking the biggest threat and retreating. For an instant, Kane felt a surge of admiration for her fearless stance. She exuded danger in a way that matched the predator before them. The creature's ears flattened, and it lunged at Sharen, jaws snapping. Kane fired a salvo of bullets, scoring hits across the beast's flank. It screeched in pain, momentum knocking Sharen aside. She hit the muddy ground in a roll, sprang up and smashed the branch against the predator's skull with enough force to splinter the wood. The creature roared, then turned its glowing gaze on Kane, who was already reloading. Before it could lunge again, Sharen dashed in from behind, hooking an arm around its neck in a chokehold. Even with her wrists bound, she managed to twist the creature's head, her slender muscles straining. It thrashed wildly, nearly tossing her off, but Kane seized the opening to plant the rifle barrel against its ribs and fire point blank. With a final agonized snarl, the predator collapsed, shaking the ground. Sharen landed in a crouch beside it, panting, eyes narrowed in triumph. Her chest rose and fell with each ragged breath. Leon and Torres approached carefully. Torres attempted a wry grin, though blood still ran down his forehead. "Damn," he muttered. "Remind me not to get on your bad side." Sharen rose, tossing the shattered branch aside. "So you already are," she said coolly, though Kane noticed the faint tremor in her arms. That creature was no small foe, and she was still bound, battered from the crash. There was an undercurrent of exhaustion in her posture, but her pride refused to show it openly. Kane studied her for a heartbeat, refusing to let her see the flicker of concern that crossed his mind. "Let's find shelter," he repeated. The kill had been noisy, and if more predators roamed nearby, they would come. Wordlessly, Sharen nodded and took the lead again. By dusk, or whatever passed for it on this planet, they found a partial clearing beside a rocky outcrop. The stone formation provided some cover, and thick foliage formed a natural barricade around the perimeter. Leon helped Torres down onto a flat stone, examining the gash on his head. Kane checked the supplies. They'd salvaged from the transport, a med kit, limited rations, some emergency flares, and the stolen data drive. The meager inventory would have to suffice. Sharen prowled the perimeter, ensuring no immediate threats lingered. When she returned, the glow in her tattoos was dim, signifying her drained energy. She cast a sidelong look at the humans as though expecting them to command her or chain her to a rock. Kane just set the rifle aside, near enough to grab, but not aimed at her. He jerked his head at Torres's bloody leg. "You want to help or just stand there?" She hesitated. Then, with a low exhale, she knelt beside Torres. Leon, uncertain, stepped aside, keeping his blaster within reach. Sharen examined the wound, her ears angled down in concentration. She pressed a hand near the torn flesh. Torres hissed at the touch, but didn't pull away. "Hold still," she muttered. With deft motions, she used the medkit to disinfect and seal the cut. Cain watched, alert to any sign she might be harming his soldier instead. But her work was efficient, if brusque. Once she finished, Torres managed a tired nod. "Thanks," he said, still eyeing her warily. She didn't reply. Cain let out a breath, scanning the darkening jungle. The clamor of insects and nocturnal creatures rose, forming an eerie orchestra. Flickers of phosphorescent plants dotted the underbrush, giving the clearing a ghostly ambience. He knew they were in for a long night, and if rescue didn't come soon, or if enemy ships arrived first, they'd be stranded with only each other. Sharen stood, her posture guarded. Her eyes glinted as she regarded Cain. "You should probably secure me," she said with a dark twist of her lips. "I might run off and cause trouble." Cain watched her for a moment, considering. "If you wanted to run, you would have done it already," he said. "But try anything, and I won't hesitate to put you down." She let out a scoffing laugh. "You can try." Then her voice dropped lower, more intimate, her ears flicking. "I'm curious, though. What will you do when command demands my head? You'll have to decide whether to hand me over or defy them, unless you're a good little soldier who does as he's told." Something hot, almost electric, surged between them. Cain rose to his full height, stepping close enough that he could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the faint luminescence. That traced her collarbone. "I do what I must," he said, voice quiet but firm, "and right now I must keep you alive for reasons of my own." Her eyes gleamed and her lips parted, as if she was about to say something cutting. Instead, she simply turned away, moving to the edge of the clearing to keep watch. Cain let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. A swirl of conflicting emotions rose in him: respect for her fierceness, annoyance at her defiance, and an undercurrent of something he refused to name. He shook it off and went to check on his men. As the hours passed, they settled into a tense routine. Lien dozed fitfully, rifle cradled in his arms. Torres stayed awake, though his leg injury limited his mobility. Sharen perched atop a low boulder, scanning the tree line with those sharp, glowing eyes, her ears flicking at every rustle. Cain found himself restless, pacing near the center of the clearing, hyper-aware of the dark. Occasionally, his gaze drifted to where Sharen kept watch. Her silhouette, lit by patches of moonlight and the glow of her markings, struck him as unearthly, alien, beautiful in a dangerous way. A sudden screech tore through the night. Everyone tensed, hearts pounding. But the noise receded. Just another predator in the distance. The jungle was alive with tension, a backdrop to the unspoken friction between human and alien. Through it all, Cain tried to ignore the subtle reaction his body had whenever she moved or spoke, like a low current humming at the edge of his consciousness. Eventually, dawn broke, the sky shifting to a pale greenish tint, visible through the canopy. They ate sparingly from the rations and patched up bruises. Sharen helped gather some edible fruits, surprising everyone with her knowledge of local flora. She seemed to relish her independence, rarely letting them see how much the cuffs bothered her. Only once did Cain catch her rubbing at the raw skin around her wrists with a pained grimace. They needed a plan. The data drive burned a hole in Cain's pocket, a constant reminder of his mission. If they could find a working transmitter or salvage an old beacon, they might still send a distress signal. "We should keep moving," he said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Sharen didn't respond, just started walking. Torres limped after her, with Lien supporting him. Cain took up the rear, scanning for threats. The jungle stretched on endlessly. As they trudged through thick mud, pushing aside vines and enormous leaves, the tension between Sharen and Cain remained taut like a drawn bow. Every glance they exchanged was charged. She would challenge him with a sarcastic comment, and he'd respond in kind, each trying to get under the other's skin. Hours later, they stumbled upon ancient ruins, swallowed by moss and creeping vines. Stone pillars jutted from the ground at odd angles, carved with alien symbols. Sharen paused, running her fingers over the markings. A spark of recognition lit her eyes. "This might be one of the old outposts," she said softly. "My people used them centuries ago." Cain frowned. Could there be a working transmitter here? Sharen shrugged, the movement graceful. Maybe. Or maybe it's all been reclaimed by the jungle. She hesitated, then cast a glance over her shoulder. If it's intact, you get your rescue. If it's not, you might die here, with your precious data drive. He stared at her, trying to puzzle out her motive. Finally, he gestured forward. Show us. The small group ventured deeper into the ruins, weaving through toppled columns and broken statues. A thick canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into faint shafts of greenish glow. The air felt cooler here, almost stagnant. At the base of a crumbling tower, they found an entrance leading underground. The passage descended into darkness, stale air filling their lungs as they stepped carefully down a flight of stone steps. Torres lit a chemical flare, illuminating a narrow corridor lined with strange inscriptions. Sharen took the lead again, her tail swaying as she moved, ears perked. She ran a hand over the inscriptions, occasionally pausing as if to interpret them. Cain could almost taste the tension in her. She was close to something, maybe a secret, from her exiled past. When the corridor ended in a rusted metal door, Sharen pressed a palm against it. The door gave a metallic groan and slid partially open, revealing a small chamber. At the center stood a pedestal with an ancient console, clearly more advanced than its surroundings. Dust coated everything. Cain, Lien, and Torres exchanged looks. This might be their best chance. Cain stepped forward, brushing off the consoles. Surface. If this works, we can send out a signal, patch in the data, and... Sharen cut him off with a withering look. It's not that simple. These consoles were meant for planetary monitoring and internal transmissions, but there might be a backup system. She tried to access the panel, frowning as it lit up faintly. Her tattoos glowed in response, as if resonating with the ancient technology. Keep watch, she said flatly. Lien and Torres took positions at the entry, while Cain hovered behind Sharen, rifle slung. He noticed the slight tremble of her shoulders, the concentration etched on her face. She was doing something with the interface that looked more intuitive than logical, her body physically reacting to each beep and flicker. For a moment, the air buzzed with an energy Cain couldn't quite identify. Then the console flared bright, lighting the chamber in a sickly green. A mechanical hum rose from beneath the floor. Sharen withdrew her hands like she'd been burned. She swore under her breath, stepping back as a hiss of pressurized air escaped from hidden vents around the chamber. What did you do? Cain demanded. I activated something, she snapped. I'm not sure what. The system is half offline. Her words cut off as a stasis pod along the wall hissed and popped open, releasing a plume of cold fog. Inside lay a shriveled alien corpse, decades or centuries old. More pods cracked open across the chamber, and each released clouds of frigid vapor. Lien whipped around, brandishing his weapon. We're not alone down here, he muttered. Figures emerged, some skeletal, some partially intact, all wearing remnants of advanced suits, the remains of an ancient guard detail, perhaps. Their motion was jerky, unnatural, propelled by flickering servo mechanisms in their suits. With a rattling moan, they advanced. Torres fired first, blasting apart one of the reanimated suits. Sharen cursed, bounding away from the console. Cain let loose a volley of gunfire, but the husks kept coming, unstoppable as machines. Oh, hideous, half-broken alien soldier lunged at Sharen, jaws snapping. She kicked it back, hooking her cuffed arms around its neck and ripping away the mechanical harness that kept it moving. Sparks flew. The corridor behind them echoed with the scraping of more undead guardians drawn by the noise. Cain barked orders, adrenaline spiking. We need to get out, now! Bullets tore through ancient flesh and metal with sickening crunches, but for every one that fell, 2 more emerged. The stench of decay mingled with the ozone of shorting electronics. Sharen vaulted over a fallen husk, landing beside Cain. He gave a curt nod, fury blazing in his eyes as he fought. She pressed herself back against him, covering his flank. He could feel her body's heat, the glow of her tattoos bright in the darkness. Together, they blasted through waves of lumbering undead, the resonance of their combat almost rhythmic. At one point, Cain's rifle jammed, and Sharen grabbed a dropped alien blade from the floor, hurling it to him. He caught it midair. slashing through a rotted soldier that lunged from the side. Torres and Lien struggled near the exit, beating back the swarm. The hiss of servo motors sounded behind them. "We're surrounded," Lien shouted, voice laced with panic. Sharen exchanged a quick look with Kane. Without words, they dove into action, forging a path toward the corridor, cutting through rotting bodies and mechanical limbs. Sharen clawed at one that latched onto her leg, hissing in pain when it nearly dragged her down. Kane shot the creature point-blank, teeth clenched. Somehow they reached the corridor, slamming the door shut behind them. The undead hammered on the other side, muffled groans echoing. For a breathless moment, all four survivors leaned against the walls, panting in the flickering light of Lien's flare. Torres's eyes were wild. What the hell was that? Some sort of ancient experiment? Sharen shook her head. These outposts predate my exile. They used stasis pods for emergency defense. My guess is the system tried to wake them as guardians, but they're corrupted. Kane set his jaw. Then that console's worthless to us now. We can't hold off an entire undead army just to send a distress signal. He turned to Sharen. You led us here. Next time, maybe warn us. She squared her shoulders, tail snapping. Don't blame me for your ignorance. I'm trying to help you get off this planet. Before he could retort, a heavy thud struck the door behind them, causing the metal to buckle slightly. Sharen pointed down the corridor. Move, or you'll all end up as one of those things. They sprinted through the passage, the stench of mold and rotten flesh pursuing them. The corridor opened into another chamber, but the floor was partially collapsed, revealing a gaping pit. Kane saw no other route. Lien peered over the edge, shining his flare. About 20 feet down, a rocky cavern extended. The moans of undead grew louder behind them. Kane shot a glance at Sharen, who bared her teeth in frustration. We jump, she said. It's the only way out. Lien paled, Torres grimacing. Fine, Kane growled. Go. Sharen took the lead, leaping gracefully into the darkness below. She landed in a crouch, rolling to absorb the impact. Kane followed, dropping after her, the jolt rattling his bones. Torres and Lien jumped last, Lien nearly losing his grip on Torres as they landed. Above, the undead battered the corridor, but they seemed reluctant to follow into the pit. The cavern they found themselves in was a labyrinth of twisting tunnels. The air was damp, the walls slick with bioluminescent fungi. Sharen rose, scanning the eerie glow. She inhaled, her ears rotating as if searching for an exit. Kane steadied himself, ignoring the aches that came from constant fighting and crashing. Which way? She pointed down a tunnel where the fungus glowed more brightly. Upward slope, I can feel a draft. It might lead to the surface. They trudged onward, the ground uneven and slick. Water dripped from stalactites overhead, echoing. One misstep could send them falling into hidden pits. Lien took point using the flare. Sharen moved behind him, Kane behind her. Torres brought up the rear, limping but determined. Time lost meaning in the darkness. Hours or perhaps minutes passed in a haze of exhaustion and tension. Occasionally, the tunnel opened into larger chambers filled with shimmering subterranean ponds or odd crystal formations that reflected the light of their flare in rainbow prisms. Despite everything, the place had a haunting beauty. Kane noticed Sharen's momentary awe when they passed a cluster of luminescent crystals. For a heartbeat, she looked almost serene, ears relaxed, eyes widened in quiet wonder. Then she hardened again, as though remembering who she was and what company she kept. They encountered no immediate threats, which felt unnerving after so many brushes with death. Finally, a faint glow ahead signaled an exit. They quickened their pace, emerging into the open air at the base of a waterfall. The sun overhead was high, suggesting midday. The water cascaded down mossy rocks, forming a clear pool. Despite the relief of fresh air, Kane stayed wary. No sign of predators or enemies, but that meant little. Sharen's furred ears perked, listening. We're far from our crash site, she said softly, but I don't know exactly where. Torres sank to the ground beside the pool, exhaustion evident. Lien quietly offered him water. Kane set his rifle aside, taking a moment to breathe. In the humid, earthy scent of the jungle again, Sharen stood at the edge of the pool, eyes half closed, letting the mist settle on her skin and hair. The swirling tattoos on her arms flickered, as though trying to recharge from the environment. She sighed, rolling her shoulders. "These cuffs are draining me. I can't fully heal or sense my surroundings like this." Cain eyed her warily. "You earned those cuffs." She turned, lips curling in a challenge. "Am I still your prisoner? Or have I proven useful enough for you to remove them?" He paused. The memory of her tearing through that predator in the jungle, the unwavering courage in the command center, it all flashed through his mind. She was dangerous, yes, but also the reason they were still alive. A tremor of conflict rippled through him. If he freed her, she might escape, or she might kill him. But if he kept her bound, her powers remained limited, and any chance they had of escaping this planet, together, would suffer. He stalked closer, noticing the water droplets that clung to her hair and shoulders. She didn't back away, though her ears flicked with tension. "I'll consider it," he said finally, "but we need to be sure you won't turn on us." Her eyes narrowed. "You need me," she said, and it wasn't arrogance, more a simple statement of fact. "You know that." Before Cain could respond, a distant rumble shook the earth beneath them. Birds screeched and took flight from the canopy. Sharen's ears flattened. Lien and Torres jumped upright, scanning for danger. A moment later, a low-flying craft roared overhead, trailing black smoke. It passed quickly, but the deafening noise lingered. Cain grimaced. "We're not alone on this planet anymore. That means we could have company. Friendly or hostile, I can't say." Sharen gave him a sidelong glance. "And if it's your people, what then? Are you going to hand me over like a nice little soldier?" The question hung in the air, loaded with meaning Cain wasn't ready to confront. He turned away. "First, we survive." He looked at Torres and Lien. "Let's move. With that craft overhead, someone might be landing nearby." They packed up quickly. Torres, though injured, gritted his teeth and hobbled on. The group skirted the waterfall, following the river downstream. Now and then they heard distant aircraft or echoes of explosions, suggesting a broader conflict was playing out. Sharen kept her ears pinned forward, occasionally guiding them around thick underbrush or warning them of hidden creatures. Despite everything, Cain found himself relying on her senses, trusting her more than he expected. A reluctant partnership indeed. As they crossed a large clearing, the hair on the back of Cain's neck stood up. He raised a fist, signaling everyone to halt. Sharen tensed, inhaling sharply. Lien gripped his weapon. Quietly they surveyed the area. Nestled in the tall grass were strange devices, half buried with blinking lights. Cain didn't recognize the design, but they looked like landmines, alien ones. Sharen's lips parted. "Traps," she whispered. "They're rigged to blow if we get too close." Lien cursed under his breath. "Who the hell laid these out here?" Cain scanned the perimeter. "Could be bounty hunters or a faction from your people trying to recapture you." Sharen's tail flicked in agitation. "My people banished me. They have no reason to waste resources on me now." He fixed her with a hard stare. "Unless you're important enough that they don't want you in human hands." She returned, his stare with unflinching intensity. "Let's not stand here debating. You first, soldier." He almost smirked, acknowledging the challenge in her tone. Carefully they maneuvered around the field of mines, stepping only on patches of earth Sharen indicated as safe. The tension was suffocating, each footstep measured. One misstep and they'd be vaporized. Halfway through, Torres stumbled. Lien caught him, but the near slip sent a spike of adrenaline through them all. When they finally emerged from the trap-laden clearing, they took a moment to breathe. Then, without warning, a shot rang out from somewhere above. Cain felt the burn of a grazing round across his shoulder. He hit the ground, rifle aimed upward. Sharen dropped beside him, scanning the treetops. More gunfire rained down, bright pulses scorching the earth around them. A group of armed fighters rappelled from the branches, wearing patchwork armor. Their leader, a tall figure with a scarred face, pointed a rifle at Sharen. "There." "She is," he snarled. "They said we'd find the exiled princess with a human squad. Guess the bounty was right." Sharen's eyes flashed. Bounty? So that's what this is about now? The scarred leader sneered. Your warlord wants you back dead or alive. Didn't pay me to ask questions, Kane spat, steadying his rifle. You're standing in our way. The bounty hunters spread out, weapons at the ready. Kane silently tallied the odds. Sharen was still cuffed, Torres was injured, Lean was pinned. Gunfire rattled the clearing. Sharen rolled behind a fallen log, her eyes darting for an opening to strike back. Kane returned fire, each shot forcing the mercenaries to duck. The leader shouted orders, demanding they capture Sharen alive, but kill the humans. Through the chaos, Kane heard Sharen's feral hiss. She pressed herself against the log, arms raised protectively. The cuffs crackled, restricting her powers. He felt a surge of anger. She was handicapped by those cuffs in the middle of a firefight meant for her capture. Growling, he crawled over to her, bullets whizzing overhead. You want me to remove these? He shouted, pulling out a small device from his belt. A universal lockpick. Now might be our only chance. She looked at him with raw intensity. Do it, or we die here. Kane jammed the device into the cuffs, ignoring the shots peppering the log. He twisted the pick, sparks flaring as the cuffs fail-safe. Tried to repel the tampering. A sharp jolt ran through his arm, but he gritted his teeth, forcing the mechanism to disengage. With a sputter of sparks, the cuffs clicked open. Sharen yanked her wrists free, eyes blazing. The effect was immediate. Her tattoos glowed with renewed brilliance, radiating warmth. She let out a sharp breath, ears perking fully upright. The savage grin that stretched her lips made Kane's heart pound in an odd mixture of anticipation and caution. Now you'll... See, she murmured. She sprang up, bounding across the clearing faster than human eyes could track. Before the bounty hunters could react, she was upon them. Claws extended, she snatched a rifle from one mercenary, then slammed him into a tree. Another mercenary tried to fire at her, but she somersaulted away, releasing a feral growl that seemed to vibrate the air itself. Kyan used the distraction to pick off two more. Lian managed a headshot on a sniper in the branches. Torres, though injured, propped himself on one knee and let loose a barrage of cover fire. The mercenaries panicked under the sudden, furious assault. Sharen vaulted between them with predatory grace, her glowing tattoos streaking the air. With after-images, she roared a phrase in her native tongue, the pitch so resonant it rattled Kane's skull. The mercenaries clutched their ears, disoriented. Kane took advantage, gunning down two more as they stumbled. The scarred leader realized too late they'd miscalculated. He tried to retreat, shouting for reinforcements, but Sharen tackled him to the ground, knee pressing into his chest. She pinned his weapon aside, glaring. "Tell your warlord," she hissed, "that I'm no one's property." She slammed her palm against his temple, a jolt of luminous energy bursting forth. The bounty hunter's eyes rolled back and he collapsed unconscious. The remaining mercenaries fled, leaving behind their wounded. Kane glanced around, breath coming in sharp gasps. The clearing was now littered with battered bodies. Sharen stood chest-heaving, her newly freed arms glimmering with residual energy. Lean helped Torres up, and they regrouped near Kane. Sharen wiped sweat from her brow, refusing to meet anyone's gaze for a long moment. Finally, Kane broke the silence. "You didn't kill him." Her ears angled back, a faint defiance in her tone. "I only kill those who deserve it. He was just a hired gun. Let him report that I'm not so easily captured." Kane nodded. Something in her words flickered across his mind. Once he might have assumed all enemies deserved to die. But he sensed a complexity in her that went beyond raw brutality. The adrenaline was still pumping, the fight a heady brew of violence and survival. He felt a stirring inside him, some primal awareness that she was more than an adversary or an ally. She was both, and something in between. In the aftermath, they searched the fallen mercenaries for supplies, finding ration packs and a comm device. Lean tinkered with it, face brightening. "This might still work. We can call for evac. If any human ships are close, they'll hear us." Kane watched Sharen carefully. She was free now, no longer bound. If she wanted to vanish into the jungle, she could. Yet she lingered, arms crossed, tail swishing. He cleared his throat. "We'll see if the signal goes through." Then we can plan our next move, Sharen scoffed. How you expect me to just wait here with your men for some human rescue? Maybe I have my own plans. Kane studied her, noticing the lingering tension in her shoulders. She was testing him, as always. You want to go? He said. Go. I'm not stopping you anymore. Her eyes narrowed, flicking from his face to Torres's injured state, to Lien's uncertain posture. The faint glow in her markings pulsed, betraying a momentary spike in emotion, pity, concern, resignation. She turned away with a growl. I'm not leaving just yet. She didn't elaborate, but Kane felt a sense of relief, though he refused to show it. The jungle grew quiet again. They formed a loose circle around the clearing, Torres resting against a fallen log, Lien fiddling with the comm device, Sharen pacing the perimeter, and Kane wiping sweat from his brow, rifle at the ready. Despite the tension, the group felt more cohesive than before, bound by the battles they'd survived together. An hour later, Lien's voice cut through the silence. I have a partial signal. I'm trying to boost it. He fiddled with the device, turning a dial that screeched with static. This is Sergeant Lien of the 105th. Do any human forces read me? Static. Then faintly a voice crackled. Lieutenant, we read you. Coordinates? Lien's eyes widened. We're on an uncharted continent, crashed with minimal supplies. Requesting immediate evac. Hostile forces present. Repeat, requesting immediate evac. He gave approximate coordinates based on the comm device's rudimentary sensors. The static crackled. Copy that. Nearest friendly unit is hours away. Hold your position if you can. We'll do what we can to reach you. Over. Kane exchanged a glance with Sharen. Hours away was a lifetime on this hostile world. We'll wait, he said grimly. Set up a perimeter. Prepare for trouble. Sharen rolled her eyes. I've been preparing for trouble my entire life. The group dug in, setting up rudimentary defenses around the clearing. They rationed food, kept watch in shifts, and tried to keep Torres stable. Sharen used her sharpened senses to scan for incoming threats. Periodically, the comm device crackled with updates, the rescue team's ETA shifting. The hours dragged on, tension rising as day bled into evening once more. At some point during the night, when Lien and Torres dozed, Kane found Sharen, perched atop a fallen tree trunk near the clearing's edge. Her silhouette glowed faintly with her markings, the gentle pulse matching her heartbeat. He approached quietly, stopping a few feet away. You don't sleep, he observed. She glanced at him, ears flicking. Not when I'm surrounded by humans who once kept me locked in a cage. He exhaled, stepping closer until he could see her expression in the dim light. I had my orders, I followed them. Her tail lashed. Yes, a good soldier, as I said before. Silence stretched between them. The chorus of jungle insects seemed to swell, filling the space. Finally, he spoke. I've been fighting your people for a long time, he said. Lost and friends in the war, family. She watched him warily, as though expecting a hateful rant. Instead, he continued. But I've seen cruelty on both sides. Politics, greed, betrayals. You're not the first alien I've captured, but you're the first I've let go. A faint smirk curved her lips. Should I feel honored? You should feel something, he retorted, but there was no venom in it. He let the tension rise another notch. Her presence made his heart thunder in a way that had nothing to do with fear. When she looked at him, he felt the weight of every kill, every act of violence balanced by a strange sense of possibility. We need each other to survive here, that's all. She stood in one fluid movement, stepping off the trunk and facing him. They were close enough that the tips of her furred ears nearly brushed his forehead. Her voice lowered. But what happens when your rescue arrives? You'll return to your base. I'll be taken for interrogation or worse. Do you think you can stop that? He wanted to say yes, but the words stuck in his throat. His sense of duty warred with an inexplicable need to protect her. We'll figure it out, he said at last. She studied him, searching for deception. Then, with a frustrated sigh, she turned away. You think everything can be solved with brute force or soldierly resolve, but you haven't seen the politics behind it. The warlord who exiled me wants me dead. Your superiors might find it convenient to hand me over and keep the peace." Before he could reply, she shrugged, tail swishing. "But I'm done talking for now. Keep your watch, soldier." She walked away, leaving him staring after her, jaw tight with conflicting emotions. Night stretched on, restless. Cain tried to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, felt the echo of her presence, remembered the raw power she unleashed in battle. Her closeness ignited something in him, like sparks dancing around dry tinder. He wanted to trust her, but reason screamed he shouldn't. Sometime around dawn, he drifted off for a short spell, only to be awakened by the screech of the comm device. "Ground team, do you copy? This is the rescue transport. We're 5 minutes out, acknowledge." Cain jolted upright, adrenaline surging. Lien and Torres scrambled to gather their gear. Sharon stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed. Her face was unreadable. Cain keyed the device. "We copy. We've got wounded. Clear the area at the southern clearing and watch for hostiles." They prepared quickly. Torres could barely walk, so Lien shouldered most of his weight. Cain nodded at Sharon. "Stay close," he said. "This is it." She didn't reply, but she followed. They trudged south through the thinning jungle until they found a suitable open spot for the transport to land. The distant rumble of engines grew steadily louder, and Cain's heart pounded with anticipation. They were finally getting off this planet. But at what cost? The transport appeared above the treetops, a clunky grey vessel bearing human military markings. It kicked up dirt and debris as it descended, side hatch open. A squad of human soldiers leapt out, weapons raised. The commanding officer marched forward, a tall woman with sharp features scanning the group. Cain stepped up. "Sergeant Cain, ID 105th, we have critical intel." He tapped the pocket containing the data drive. "And we have an alien defector. She's been assisting us." The officer's gaze fell on Sharon, who eyed the weapons pointed at her with practiced calm. "We'll debrief you on board," the officer said curtly. "All of you, move." Lien and Torres climbed aboard first. Sharon hesitated. Cain saw the apprehension flicker in her eyes. This was the moment of truth. She stepped forward, tail coiled tight, ignoring the rifles aimed her way. The officer nodded, and the soldiers parted, letting her pass. Inside the transport they strapped in. The officer signaled the pilot and the craft lifted off. Sharon sat across from Cain, her posture rigid, eyes fixed on the floor. The entire squad seemed on edge, well aware of her lethal capabilities. Cain's mind spun. He had the data drive. Command would want it, and then they'd want her. But something in him refused to let them chain her up again. The flight back to the fleet was unnervingly short. Within the hour, they docked aboard a massive battleship. Medical personnel rushed to tend to Torres while Lien followed, giving statements to the officer. Cain escorted Sharon onto the deck, tension boiling. The stares from passing soldiers cut like blades. Whispers about the furry alien who'd fought at Cain's side spread rapidly. They were guided to a briefing room lined with monitors. A stern-faced general awaited them, flanked by armed guards. Cain handed over the data drive, standing at attention as protocol dictated. The general barely acknowledged him before turning, cold eyes on Sharon. "This is the exiled princess we've heard about?" Cain frowned slightly. "She's assisted in retrieving the intel, sir. Saved multiple human lives in the process." The general snorted. "So we're supposed to be grateful." He flicked a hand at the guards. "Take her into custody until we decide how to proceed." Cain felt a pulse of anger. He stepped forward, stiffening. "Sir, she willingly helped us. We'd be dead without her." The general gave Cain a hard look. "I understand you have some misguided loyalty to this alien, Sergeant, but your job is done." He waved the guards forward. They seized Sharon's arms, forcibly restraining her. She didn't resist at first, but Cain saw the flash of rage in her eyes, her tail lashing. Instinctively he moved to intervene, but the general barked, "Stand down, soldier!" Time seemed to slow. Sharon locked eyes with Cain, an almost imperceptible plea behind her defiance. The tension that had been simmering between them, building over battles and shared survival, now surged to a breaking point. Cain's fists clenched. He had a choice: obey the chain of command or fight for the alien who had proven herself again and again. "Sir, with respect," he began. The general cut him off. "One more word, Sergeant, and I'll have you court-martialed. We'll decide what to do with her. Now get out of my sight." Sharen struggled, her voice a low snarl. Kane's heart hammered. Without a second thought, he moved to forcibly remove the guard's grip on her. They whirled, rifles raised. The general shouted something, and a flurry of motion erupted. Kane's training kicked in, adrenaline fueling a desperate gamble. He disarmed the guard nearest him, twisting the rifle away. Another guard lunged, but Sharen struck him with a snap of her elbow, tail whipping. The general backed up, sputtering in fury. Before the entire deck could swarm them, Kane grabbed Sharen's hand. "We're getting out of here," he growled. She didn't hesitate. They bolted, weaving through corridors. Sirens blared and overhead lights flashed red. It was the two of them against an entire battleship's complement, but Kane refused to stop. He felt her grip tighten, the heat of her body, the electric tingle of her tattoos pressing through the thin fabric of his uniform. They ducked into a maintenance corridor. Sharen's breath came in sharp bursts. "Are you insane?" she hissed, half laughing, half panicked. Kane pressed a panel, locking the door behind them. "Probably. But I'm not letting them throw you to the wolves." She blinked, ears folded back in confusion. Then an odd, triumphant grin curved her lips. "You're defying your own kind for me?" He exhaled. "Let's just say I'm doing what's right. Don't get used to it." Quickly, they navigated the winding corridors, avoiding patrols. Kane had spent enough time on ships like this to know the access points. Every alarm was blaring their presence. With each passing moment, the net closed tighter. They burst onto the flight deck, taking cover behind crates as troopers scrambled to seal off hangars. Gunfire ricocheted, forcing them deeper behind the crates. Sharen's eyes flicked around, searching for an exit. "There," she said, pointing to a small shuttle at the far end of the hangar. "If we get inside, we can outrun them." Kane nodded. They sprinted across open space. Bullets whizzing past. A trooper tackled Kane, slamming him to the deck. He grunted, struggling. Sharen leapt onto the trooper's back, her claws ripping him away. Blood sprayed, and she hauled Kane up by his collar. With hearts thudding, they dashed the remaining. Distance punching the shuttle's access panel. The hatch slid open with a hiss, and they scrambled inside. The flight deck roared with shouts. Soldiers rushed to block the shuttle, but Kane sealed the hatch, lunging into the pilot's seat. Sharen took co-pilot, quickly scanning the controls with alien speed and flipping the right switches. The shuttle's engines rumbled to life. She locked eyes with him, a fierce energy shining there. "Let's see if your human contraption can keep up with me," she said, a feral grin on her lips. They blasted out of the hangar, evading a volley of anti-ship lasers. The battleship's guns roared behind them, but the shuttle's engines spooled to maximum thrust, streaking into the dark of space. Kane's pulse pounded in his ears. He glanced at Sharen, who was leaning into the controls, tail swaying behind her. The starlight glistened off the faint sheen of sweat on her brow. They were free, for now. Minutes stretched as they navigated away from the blockade of human ships. Kane expected pursuit, interceptors ready to blast them to pieces, but some stroke of luck or chaos gave them a clear path. Once certain they were out of immediate danger, Kane slumped back in the seat, exhaling a ragged breath. Sharen turned to him. The tension between them crackled, heavier than ever, a swirl of relief, anger, and undeniable magnetism. Neither spoke for a moment. Then, with a shaky laugh, she said, "You really are insane." He unbuckled himself, turning to face her. "If I'd let them take you, I'd have regretted it." Her eyes gleamed, flicking to his lips, then back to his eyes. "What do we do now?" Before he could respond, the console beeped, indicating a stable orbit but low fuel. They had no safe harbor among humans or her own people. They were outcasts, thrown together by fate. In the small cabin, the quiet hum of the engines seemed to magnify every breath. Kane reached out, brushing his fingers against the glowing lines. On her forearm. She inhaled sharply, not pulling away. For once the combat was over, but the tension remained, burning hotter than ever. She placed her hand over his, ear twitching. "I owe you," she murmured, voice husky. But don't think that means I submit." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I never expected you to." In that moment, words failed them. The building attraction that had simmered through every argument, every fight, came to a head. He caught her chin, the tip of her furred ear brushing his temple. She tugged him closer by the collar of his uniform, breath hot against his lips. When their mouths finally collided, it wasn't gentle. It was a clash of wills, as though they were still fighting, but with teeth and tongue instead of bullets and claws. She bit his lower lip, a growl rumbling in her throat. He answered, by tangling a hand in her hair, pulling her against him. The tension of their flight, their betrayal of his superiors, the savage relief of still being alive, it all ignited in that kiss. She yielded for a split second, then pushed back, trying to take control. Cain held firm, refusing to let her dominate completely. They broke apart with a gasp, both panting. Her eyes were dark with something beyond anger or fear, need. "You're not like any human I've met," she rasped, tail curling around his leg. He felt it constrict gently, a reminder of her lethal grace. "You risked everything for me," he swallowed. "You saved my life, more than once." He traced a thumb over the faint glow of her markings. "We'll figure out what happens next together." She shivered under his touch, then abruptly pulled back, remembering the cockpit around them. The instruments blinked. The vacuum of space was a silent witness to their newfound tangled bond. She settled back into the co-pilot seat, her breathing unsteady, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "If we don't find fuel or a safe port soon, all this is pointless." Cain nodded, adrenaline spiking again. "I know of a black market station on the fringe. We can hide there, refuel, and plan our next move. We'll be hunted by both sides now." Her ears flattened slightly. "The warlord won't stop until he has my head, and your command likely labeled you a traitor for aiding me." She looked away, a hint of guilt surfacing. "I never wanted you dragged into this." He reached over, catching her chin to make her face him again. "If I was worried about that, I wouldn't have fought those guards." The seriousness in his tone sent a wave of unfamiliar warmth through her. She tried to smirk, but ended up swallowing a mix of relief and something deeper. She turned back to the controls. "Then let's survive," she said quietly. "After that you can figure out if this partnership is worth the trouble." He placed a hand over hers on the throttle, ignoring the leftover sting from battle and betrayal. The swirling glow of her tattoos pulsed under his palm, a rhythmic hum matching the new unspoken bond between them. "We will," he murmured, half to her, half to himself. "We will." They set a course for the fringe station, the stars, outside streaking as the shuttle activated its limited faster-than-light drive. The immediate crisis had passed, but the path ahead was fraught with danger. The battleship's betrayal, the warlord's endless pursuit, and the volatile nature of their mutual attraction all loomed. Yet in that cramped cockpit, the thick tension between them felt less like a threat and more like an inevitable promise. They stole glances when they thought the other wasn't looking, hearts pounding with an emotion they dared not name. Despite exhaustion, neither slept. They navigated the star charts, occasionally brushing arms or locking eyes over flickering readouts. Each accidental touch fanned the embers of that raw, unacknowledged desire. Hours later, the shuttle lurched out of FTL, arriving at the edge of a system littered with debris and pirate radio signals. There it was, the black market station, barely. More than a sprawling hunk of interconnected modules drifting near a small moon. Flickering neon signs in multiple alien scripts advertised weapons, fuel, vices. Cain keyed the comm, using old codes from his shady contacts. They were granted docking clearance with minimal fuss, just as he hoped. The station's airlock clamped around the shuttle, and the engines hissed offline. He unstrapped, turning to Sharen. "You ready?" he asked, voice low, knowing full well this station was no haven, just another den of cutthroats. But at least it was somewhere they could hide for a time. Her ears perked with that predatory spark. Always. She flicked her tail, stepping past him as the hatch opened. The station's pressurized corridor whooshed with stale air. Cain felt a pang of anticipation. Here they were, Two fugitives from opposite sides of a galactic war, stepping into a realm where no one cared about allegiances. Credits and cunning ruled all. The corridor lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow. Sharen's eyes darted, around scanning for threats. Kane hovered close at her side, hand on his sidearm. They reached a checkpoint manned by a bored-looking alien with a drooping face. He barely glanced at them, merely gestured for a scanning device to check for weapons. Sharen arched an eyebrow, letting them scan her. Kane offered his sidearm for the mandatory check. The bored alien waved them through with a grunt. Passed. The checkpoint. The station opened into a maze of corridors lit by flickering neon. Vendors hawked contraband, from illegal weapon modifications to exotic narcotics. Holographic signs flashed overhead, offering shady deals. All around, creatures of every shape and size milled about with suspicious eyes. Kane led Sharen to a cramped lounge near the center. The walls vibrated with the thump of music from a bar next door. He found a table in a corner where they could talk quietly. Sharen eyed the crowd, tail coiling around one leg of her chair. "This place reeks," she muttered, wrinkling her nose. He smirked. "Which part? The corruption, the filth, or the moral decay?" "All of it," she said, ears flicking. "But I've been in worse." She turned her attention to him. "What's your plan? Keep running forever? Or will you try to make a deal with your command?" His jaw tightened. "I have to send them the data, at least. That intelligence could save human lives. But I doubt they'll welcome me back with open arms." He paused, meeting her gaze. "And you have a warlord gunning for your head. You have to confront that eventually." Her lips thinned, eyes glinting. "If I face him head-on, he'll kill me. Unless—" She trailed, off gazing at Kane as if considering an unthinkable alliance. "Unless I have someone on my side with as much to lose." He studied her, heart pounding again. They were both outcasts now, both wanted by dangerous forces. Against all odds they'd fought side by side, and something deeper burned between them. "Maybe it's time we stop running," he said quietly. Her eyes flickered, parting her, lips as if to speak. The tension between them flared once more, that unspoken heat building. She glanced away, clearly grappling with the same warring instincts. Predator and prey, yet neither quite the victim. Before they could continue, a group of heavily armed aliens entered the lounge, scanning the room. One pointed in their direction, and a hush fell among the patrons. Kine cursed under his breath, quickly recognizing the insignia. It belonged to a neutral but notoriously ruthless mercenary faction. They specialized in bounties, particularly ones that offered huge sums. Sharen stiffened. "They're here for me." Her tail lashed nervously, ears angling back. Kine rose, hand drifting to his sidearm. "Then we don't give them the chance." As the mercenaries advanced, the lounge patrons scattered or ducked behind tables. Sharen and Kane stood back to back like they'd done a dozen times. An imposing merc in the front leveled a plasma rifle at Sharen. "A certain warlord wants his runaway princess," he hissed. "You'll come quietly or we'll blast this whole place into scrap." In response, Sharen let out a warning growl, claws curling at her side. Her tattoos flared bright. Kine's voice dropped, low. "They're about to find out you're not so easily taken." Before the merc could bark another threat, Sharen dashed forward, too quick to track. She wrenched the rifle aside, forcing it to discharge harmlessly into the wall. Kane fired at the mercs who tried to flank her. Energy blasts filled the air. The lounge erupted in chaos. Tables overturned, glasses shattered, patrons screamed. The mercs were well trained, but they hadn't counted on the synergy between a battle-hardened human and an exiled alien princess. Sharen's tail whipped behind her, her body moving in a deadly dance. She grabbed a merc by the helmet, slamming him to the ground. Kane spun, blocking a strike from an electrified baton, then retaliated with a bone-crunching blow to the merc's torso. The neon lights flickered, strobing the fight in flashes of pink and green. One merc aimed a rocket launcher at the bar, intending to flush them out. Kane cursed, lunging to knock the weapon's barrel upward just as it fired. The rocket detonated on the ceiling, sending chunks of metal raining down. Sparks and smoke filled the air. The bar collapsed in a shower of debris, and the structure around them groaned ominously. People stampeded for the exits, shrieking in fear. Amid the chaos, Sharen leapt onto the bar's remains, launching herself at the rocket-wielding merc. Her claws found purchase in his armor. She tore at the straps, exposing flesh. He roared in agony, stumbling back into a row of flickering arcade machines. Kane peppered the remaining mercs with precise gunfire until they were either down or fleeing. The lounge threatened to cave in around them, alarms blaring. Through the haze, Sharen locked eyes with Kane, panting. "If I have to go," she shouted over the din. He nodded, leading her through the smoldering wreckage. The station's security might converge any moment, and they would not take kindly to an all-out firefight. Together, they darted into a side corridor, hearts pounding in unison. After winding through the station's labyrinthine passages, they found a deserted maintenance bay. Sharen braced herself against a metal pillar, breathing hard. Kane crouched beside her, scanning for pursuit. His mind raced. They'd fended off another ambush, but the net was closing. Sooner or later, they'd run out of places to hide. She clenched her fists. "Every step we take, someone new tries to kill us. I'm sick of it." He gripped her shoulder. "Then we go after the source. The warlord who put the price on. Your head. The command that wants me locked up. We make them see we're not easy prey." She laughed without humor. "Challenging the warlord is suicide. Unless we had an army." Kane's wolfish smirk resurfaced. "Or we find allies who hate him more than we do. The data drive might have something that can be leveraged." He glanced at the battered device, still tucked in his gear. "You said you know the warlord's secrets." She nodded slowly, recalling the reason for her exile. "He demanded I mate with him, unite our tribes. I refused. Exposing him might lead to a rebellion. But that's a big gamble." He leaned closer, voice low. "We don't have many options left. We fight or we keep running forever." Her gaze dropped to his lips, the raw intensity flaring again. The close proximity, the adrenaline, it all conspired to reignite the moment they'd shared in the shuttle. Kane exhaled slowly, acknowledging that each breath brought him a fraction closer to surrendering to that fierce hunger. She pressed a hand to his chest, feeling his heart hammering. "Then fight with me," she whispered, a challenge and a plea at once. He answered by pulling her in, capturing her mouth in another bruising kiss. There was a violent edge to it, the remainders of the fight scorching their senses. She bit his lip again, a low moan escaping her throat, and he pulled her closer, forcing her against the pillar with a thud. The hum of the station's failing lights and distant alarms faded, leaving only the heat coursing between them. Her claws raked gently down his back, a paradox of danger and tenderness. He growled against her mouth, half lost in the taste of her. They broke apart, chests heaving. Her eyes burned with a fire that mirrored his. "We can't stay here," she said, breathless. "But I needed that." He managed a short laugh, heart pounding. "Could have fooled me. You seemed ready to tear my throat out." She stroked the side of his face with the back of her hand. "Still might," she teased, though her voice held genuine emotion beneath the bravado. "Now let's get off this station before more bounty hunters find us." They fled deeper into the maintenance tunnels, eventually circling back to the docking bay. The shuttle they'd come in on was too recognizable. They needed a new ship. Sharen's enhanced hearing led them to a poorly guarded hangar at the station's outskirts. A sleek, mid-sized freighter waited, half covered by tarps, presumably in for repairs. The only guard was a surly reptilian mechanic who demanded an outrageous sum for the vessel. Kine lifted the data drive. "This is worth more than credits," he said, spinning a lie about top-secret coordinates. The mechanic's eyes gleamed with greed. After a tense negotiation, Kine sealed the deal with half the credits he had left, and a promise for more once the warlord's treasure was theirs. The mechanic, either foolish or desperate, agreed and transferred the ship to them. They boarded, and Sharen ran through the pre-flight checks. The freighter's interior was cramped but serviceable, with enough cargo space to hide them if necessary. She fired up the engines, and Kane watched from the co-pilot seat, admiring the way her ears perked with focus. Despite everything, he felt a jolt of anticipation. This was their chance to turn the tide. Exiting the station was easier than expected, likely because the local security was still dealing with the chaos they'd left behind. Moments later, they were in open space again, the station shrinking behind them. Sharen navigated to a safe corridor beyond the station's sensor range. Kane keyed in the data drive, scanning the files. Coordinates of the warlords. Fortress, troop deployments, supply routes. We can use this. She leaned over his shoulder, eyes flicking over the screen. I see weaknesses in his lines. If we infiltrate here and here, she pointed to strategic points, we might rally the clans he's oppressed. They'd fight for a chance to topple him. Kane nodded, the kernel of a plan forming. They would gather allies, disaffected. Tribes, mercenaries with a grudge, anyone who'd suffered under the warlord's reign. Then they'd strike. It was audacious, perhaps suicidal, but better than being hunted forever. Sharen looked at him, a fierce light in her eyes. Then, we kill him. He met her gaze. Together. She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing. Her lips curled into a dangerous smile, and for once it wasn't directed against him. Yes, together. She pressed a hand against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart. If we do this, there's no going back. Kane placed his hand over hers. There's nothing to go back to. They locked gazes, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Their bond, formed through combat, mutual mistrust, survival, and an undeniable attraction, would be tested in the fires of a war. Neither knew if they'd survive, but in that moment, they had each other. She stepped away to plot the course for the warlord's domain, tail flicking behind her. Kane glanced at her over the console, a quiet resolve settling in his gut. They had a cause that aligned with both their vendettas. The rest would fall into place or kill them trying. In the cramped cockpit, as stars stretched before them, they found a sense of purpose. The closeness that had been building ignited in stolen glances and fleeting touches. Each moment not spent discussing strategy or plotting infiltration was spent in the throes of tension that neither could ignore. Meals were short, punctuated by her teasing barbs and his deadpan retorts. Planning sessions ended with a brush of lips, a hungry kiss that left them breathless. There was no time for gentle sweetness here. Their connection was forged by necessity, tested by blood, and stoked by primal desire. Finally, the navigation console beeped. They were nearing the warlord's territory, a cluster of heavily fortified worlds. Sharen tapped controls, scanning the defenses. He's got dreadnoughts, orbital cannons, entire armies. Yet, she didn't sound intimidated. She sounded determined. Kane nodded, adrenaline coursing. We'll need to land on the outskirts, find the rebellious factions you mentioned, and rally them. That's step one. The freighter slipped past outer patrols, aided by stolen codes embedded in the data drive. In short order, they touched down on a desolate moon, its surface riven with canyons and dust storms. Sharen said many exiles, and rebel clans used these canyons as a base. If they found them, they might form an alliance. As they left the freighter, the harsh wind whipped at their faces. Kane shielded his eyes, scanning the jagged horizon. Sharen, unbothered by the dust, led the way. Her ears twitched, picking up distant sounds. "This way," she said, her voice nearly lost to the gale. They trudged through narrow canyon paths, occasionally seeing glimpses of hidden encampments carved into the rock. A group of armed aliens emerged, leveling rifles. Kane raised his hands, palms out. Sharen stepped forward, her posture regal despite the swirling dust. She announced her name in her language, claiming the right to speak with their leader. The rebels exchanged astonished looks. Some recognized her, remembering the exiled princess. They led them into a larger cavern, where a council of ragtag warriors awaited. There, Sharen revealed the data drive and her plan to depose the warlord. The rebels eyed her suspiciously. One of their leaders, a scarred female with elaborate tattoos, spat, "You expect us to trust a royal who once lived in comfort?" Sharen's ears flattened. "I was cast out because I refused to submit to his tyranny. I lost everything. Now I'm here to finish what he started." Kane backed her, detailing the warlord's vulnerabilities. Slowly, the rebels' suspicion ebbed. A grudging respect formed. There was talk of mustering forces, of infiltration, and sabotage. Kane noticed how passionately Sharen spoke, how each word resonated with the anger and hope these rebels held. In those moments, her beauty was overshadowed by her fierce resolve, and yet he found her more compelling than ever. Days blurred as they forged alliances, traveling from canyon to canyon. Some clans were hostile, but most joined once they saw the stolen data. A small army began to assemble, armed with scavenged weapons and driven by the hunger for freedom. All the while, Kane and Sharen fought side by side, quelling disputes, fending off the warlord's scouting parties. Their bond deepened with each confrontation, each near-death experience. One evening, after a grueling skirmish, they found themselves alone in a dimly lit cavern near an underground lake. Sharen's shoulders trembled from exhaustion, and she leaned against the rocky wall, panting. Kane approached, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. They locked eyes, and words became unnecessary. He slid an arm around her waist, pulling her close. She let out a shaky breath, resting her forehead against his. Their tension, once a barrier, now a lifeline. This time the kiss they shared was not fueled by immediate danger, but by raw emotion. It was no less fierce, but there was a thread of something gentler beneath it, an understanding that they might not survive the coming battle. Their bodies pressed together, hearts pounding in unison. She murmured his name, ears folding back, as her claws tentatively gripped his shoulders. He held her tighter, half afraid she might vanish if he let go. They broke apart slowly, breathing ragged. Her eyes held a flicker of vulnerability. "In case we don't win," she whispered, "I want you to know—" He brushed a finger along her jaw. "Don't. We will win." But inside, he knew the odds were grim. They sank to the ground, leaning against the stone. Even in the dark, the glow of her tattoos guided his gaze. She traced a hand over his chest, feeling the scar tissue of old battles. He kept his arm around her, letting the tension fade for a brief, precious moment. By dawn, the rebel army was on the move. They scaled jagged cliffs and wound through hidden passes, gathering outside the warlord's fortress. The fortress loomed, like an iron beast against the horizon, spires bristling with weaponry. Patrols circled overhead in sleek craft. As the rebels took positions, Sharen and Kane prepared to infiltrate the fortress from an old service tunnel. "You sure you want to do this?" Kane asked, checking his weapon one last time. She squared her shoulders. "He took my life. From me, I'll take his." She turned, pressing a quick, heated kiss to his lips. "For luck," she murmured against his mouth, then pulled away, tail flicking behind her. They led a small strike team through the tunnel, the rest of the rebels waiting for the signal to attack. Inside, the fortress corridors were eerily quiet. The walls were adorned with the warlord's insignia, a constant reminder of his power. Sharen's ears twitched, guiding them past patrols and automated defenses. Her heart hammered in her chest, each step bringing her closer to the final confrontation she'd dreaded and craved. At the heart of the fortress, they found him. The warlord sat on a throne of polished bone, clad in ornate armor. He rose slowly, removing his helmet, revealing a face twisted by scars and arrogance. "So you've returned," he said, voice echoing in the chamber. "Come to beg forgiveness?" Sharen hissed, claws extending. "I've come to end you." The warlord let out a mirthless laugh. "Foolish girl. You couldn't even stand against me before. What makes you think you can now?" His eyes slid to Kane. "A human pet? Is that your champion?" Kane fired a warning shot that ricocheted off the throne. Big talk from a tyrant who hides behind an army. The warlord's grin widened. "Army? I am the army." With a sharp gesture, hidden doors slid open, revealing an elite guard of heavily armed aliens. The strike team braced, opening fire. A ferocious battle erupted. Blades clashed, plasma bolts blazed, and the throne room became a slaughterhouse. Sharen and Kane fought side by side, each kill a testament to their lethal synergy. Amidst the chaos, the warlord advanced on Sharen. She slashed at him, but his armor absorbed the blow. He struck back with an energy mace, sending her sprawling. Cain launched himself at the warlord, grappling, but the towering alien hurled him aside like a rag doll. Sharen lunged again, fighting through pain, eyes blazing with hatred. Outside, explosions rocked the fortress. The rebels had attacked en masse, overwhelming the walls. The warlord's face contorted with fury. "All this for a worthless exile?" he roared, swinging his mace. Sharen dodged, her tattoos flaring bright. She unleashed a sonic screech that rattled the walls, forcing him to stagger. Cain seized the opening, plunging a blade into a gap in the warlord's armor. With a roar of pain, the warlord backhanded Cain, knocking him to the floor. Blood spattered, and Cain's vision blurred. Sharen leapt onto the warlord's back, her claws sinking into the plates of his armor. He bellowed, thrashing violently, but she clung tight. In one savage motion, she tore the armor at his neck, exposing flesh. Then she sank her claws in, twisting, ignoring the searing pain in her own body. The warlord let out a choked gasp, stumbling. With a final guttural snarl, Sharen yanked downward, and his lifeblood poured across the gleaming throne room floor. He fell to his knees, eyes wide with disbelief. Sharen dropped beside him, panting, covered in blood. His final breath rattled in his throat, and then he was still. The echo of the conflict reverberated, but the warlord's elite, guards seeing their leader slain, faltered. The rebels surged into the chamber, overrunning what remained of the warlord's defenses. The fortress fell. As the last of the warlord's loyalists surrendered, a ragged cheer went up among the rebels. Smoke filled the corridors, and flickering, lights cast the carnage in a ghostly glow. Sharen stumbled, adrenaline failing her. Then she remembered Cain. She turned frantically, spotting him against a shattered pillar, half-conscious. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees. Blood trickled from a gash on his temple. His eyes struggled to focus. Relief coursed through her as she pressed a hand to his face. "Stay with me," she murmured. He blinked, a shaky grin forming. "Did we—" She glanced at the warlord's corpse. "He's dead. It's over." Cain exhaled, leaning, his head back. "Good." Then he let out a weak laugh. "You really do bite." Despite the pain, she offered a small, genuine smile. "You love it." Rebel medics rushed over, helping treat Cain's wounds. Sharen was ushered outside, where the fresh air mingled with the smell of smoke. The rebel clans roared in triumph, chanting her name. They recognized her as royalty, but now as one who had fought and bled beside them. She didn't care about titles anymore. She only cared that the warlord who once wanted to force her into submission lay dead. She found Cain again, as he was bandaged, limping on his own 2 feet. The rebel crowd parted for them, cheering. In the dying light of this battered world, they locked eyes, a lifetime of shared hardship passing between them. He opened his arms and she stepped into them without hesitation, ignoring the onlookers. Their lips met in a bruised kiss that spoke of victory, relief, and an uncertain future they would face together. When they finally pulled apart, Sharen glanced around at the smoking ruins. "So it's done," she whispered. "I have no home among my people, and you have no place among yours." He wrapped an arm around her waist. "Then we make our own place, together." He looked out over the rebel forces, who now treated her as a liberator. "You could rebuild. Lead them or guide them." She inhaled, tail coiling around his leg in a gesture of trust. "Not alone," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. He pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "Never alone." For a moment, the swirl of chaos around them faded. In that stillness, they felt the certainty of a bond forged in conflict and solidified by passion. Their hearts beat in sync, a promise of a shared path ahead. And so, beneath the battered skies of a world once terrorized by a tyrant, the human and the exiled alien princess stood triumphant. The war they fought had taken everything from them, but it also gave them something neither expected to find. In the end, there was no question of captivity or scorn. There was only an undeniable connection, born of survival and sealed by choice. They had fought, bled, and nearly died for it. Now, together, they would live for it. No more running. No more cages. Just 2 fierce souls bound by a love that neither asked for, yet both could no longer deny. Their story would continue, perhaps fraught with new battles and new alliances, but for this day, in the shadow of a toppled throne, it ended exactly where it needed to end, with a shared victory, sealed by the promise of a life they would shape on their own terms, side by side, no longer alone.